Okay, we'll start part 2 of human communication and language by moving into our PowerPoint slide. Oops, this is the wrong one. Okay, so we've talked about the biology of language, the areas of the brain that are important for the production and comprehension of verbal communication, like spoken language, written language, and sign language, right? Just as kind of an interesting digression, it's something to think about. How did language, how did our spoken language, how did speech evolve? How did it emerge? How did language evolve? These are kind of separate questions, but they're tied together, right? How did language evolve in human ancestors and really not in other animal ancestors? And then how did speech evolve? Researchers and biologists like Matt Ridley, who wrote our textbook, really think that human language was originally transmitted by gesture. We use gesture in our language. That was our language, not speech. And speech is a relatively recent invention, if you will, perhaps coming as recently as the emergence of our species, Homo sapiens. There's a lot of evidence that, in fact, our first language was gesture. Here are some evidences for this hypothesis. And some of them, when we think of a hypothesis and the evidence for a hypothesis, typically each individual bit of evidence doesn't mean, wow, this hypothesis must be true. But when you get a lot of different evidences from different lines that support the same hypothesis, then you start thinking, there's a lot of evidence for this hypothesis. It's fairly strong hypothesis. Perhaps it could even be called a theory. In this case, we still call it a hypothesis, but here are our evidences. First of all, when we look at monkeys and early hominid fossils, it seems that there are a lot of pre-adaptations for expressive communication in their hands, okay? So they have better control over the movement of their hands than over vocalization. Okay. Vision is a predominant sense in our ancestors and in monkeys too. It's very important. Vision is a predominant sense. So we have these pre-adaptations that got good cortical control over hand movements, and vision is important. Okay, this is telling us something that maybe the development of gestures as a language was easier because of these pre-adaptations, or was selected for because of these pre-adaptations. Here's something really interesting. Monkeys and humans use a completely different part of the brain to make emotional calls or exclamations, like shouting out a swear word when you stub your toe, or cry, or monkeys making alarm calls use a different part of their brain. In fact, humans who can't talk at all because of a stroke or some sort of trauma to their language centers of their brain, they can often curse just fine because it's not a part of language. Your exclamations that you shout out are not like laughing and crying, and an exclamation of surprise is not a part of the language that we have. It's kind of interesting. Okay, a third piece of evidence. Early hominids, so human-like, our human ancestors, lived in an environment where selection may have favored gestures for communication. Okay, so if you're living in an open desert-like or savanna-like territory and there's a lot of predators around, it's probably better that you're not like shouting to each other, hey, let's go get that saber-toothed tiger over there, or oh, watch out for the saber-toothed tiger. You're probably going to do better with making gestures. They're more subtle. They're they're stealthier, and they're iconic. Like, look, pointing is pretty iconic. And so perhaps this is why gestures were favored over spoken language initially. There's a lot of evidence for this hypothesis about how human language was first transmitted as gesture. The Broca's area, that's the area of the brain that's important in language production, right, is also in monkeys and apes used, it's a part of the brain that's the motor region. It's used to initiate gestures, to make facial motions, to make tongue motions. Perhaps this area of the brain that's used in gesture production was kind of taken over, if you will, for making language. So language, or speech, I should say, is kind of a hand-me-down. Like, I'll take that part of the brain and now start making speech, because that part of the brain is, at least in our close relatives, in monkeys and apes, is used in gesture making. Here's another piece of evidence. Humans express language with our hands all the time, right? I do it all the time. I do it all the time, even when I'm on this video and you can't see me very well. And other evidence here, or an interesting study, shows that people who are born blind still make gestures when they're talking. Like, they make gestures when they're talking to other people. And they use them, even though they can't see them. It's kind of interesting. Here's another bit of evidence. Deaf people. Okay, people who are deaf can lose the ability to perform sign language after a stroke in the Wernicke's area, or the Broca's region. So if you have damage to that language center, you can't do sign language anymore. This has been shown, or lesions or damage to the Broca's area or the Wernicke's area have been shown to lead to deficits in expressive language or in language comprehension in people who are deaf or not, people who know sign language or not. Another interesting thing about people who are deaf, when they're participating in sign language, if an MRI is done, the same area of the brain lights up during the production of sign language. So this just tells us, I think this tells us more that sign language is language. It is language. It's the same thing as spoken language. But it also suggests that gesture language happens in that part of the brain. All of these things, like I said, kind of contribute to this understanding that, wow, it's likely that our ancestors, gestured for language first, and then that spoken language evolved secondarily. There's some fossil evidence that supports this hypothesis too. One of the things that we know is that our ancestors began using what's called bipedal locomotion. In other words, they stood up on their back legs to walk around about 5 million years ago. What that does is it frees up their hands for all sorts of things, right? For carrying things, for carrying babies, for carrying food, for carrying weapons. But it also frees up your hands for making gestures. Okay. It probably didn't evolve to free up the hands for gestures, but it allowed gesture making to happen. And a researcher named Dunbar came up with a hypothesis that says that a gesturing language took over the role of grooming to maintain social bonds in our ancestors. This is totally it's probably unprovable, but in non-human primates, grooming is critical in social bonding and in social and maintaining social structure. And we obviously don't do that. Grooming each other grooming, if you will. We, however, do spend a lot of time communicating verbally with each other about our neighbors, about the weather, about gossiping, if you will, right? Dunbar hypothesized that spoken language kind of took over, or gesturing language at first, and then spoken language kind of took over the role of grooming in our ancestors. Okay, here's some other interesting fossil record information. Fossil records as old as 3.5 million years old. So Lucy is a fossil that you're probably familiar with, is a famous fossil. It's a fossil that's an Australopithecus africanus, discovered in part of Ethiopia, and I think in the 1960s or so. She has, even 3.5 million years ago, remarkably long thumb and finger joints that could grasp objects. Manual dexterity is high here, which is going to speak well for, kind of as a pre-adaptation for selection, for gesturing as a language. She also had other specializations in her shoulder and arms that allowed her to throw things overhand. Chimpanzees can't throw things well overhand at all. Humans really can. So could Lucy. And these specializations are pretty important for gesturing language. Another bit of evidence from the fossil record suggests that in our ancient human ancestors, they didn't have the right kind of anatomy for speech, for producing speech. So Turkana who's a skeleton that's about 1.5 million years old, suggests that the thoracic vertebrae are too small to allow for breathing control during speech. And which means they probably weren't doing a lot of speech, probably doing more gestures. At least that's the idea, right? And the vocal apparatus that we have that can support speech didn't evolve until relatively recently, maybe even as recently as Homo sapiens evolved. So, or perhaps Homo erectus or Homo ergastus. But the idea here is our our speech probably followed a gesturing language. The gesturing language evolved first. At least that's the idea. So when we think about speech and as a form of verbal communication and culture, Matt Ridley talks a lot about our capacity for culture is kind of the result of a few factors. I mean, we have an enormous culture, and it's by degree very different than culture of animals. Why is that? Well, he says it's kind of the combination of the compilation of these three things. One, using our hands for gesture and manipulation, and using our voice for speech, and the capability of social learning. That combination allowed our ancestors to communicate with each other, to, in their own minds, use symbols to represent things and to communicate that to other people, using symbols to represent events and ideas that animals simply don't have. And then, once you've got this externalized memory, as Ridley calls it, the ability to share ideas with other people, you get a more complex culture. And that drives, the complexity of the culture drives the evolution of the brain, which drives the complexity of the culture, which drives the evolution of the bigger brain, and you get this development of this really rich, complex culture that humans have compared to animals. Animals have culture too, but they don't have the degree of culture that humans have. And I think Ridley is saying they don't have that primarily because we have a language, started as a gesturing language, moved into a vocal or a speech language. We have that language that we can use to express ideas in ways that nonverbal communication just can't. And then we get the accumulation of ideas for a more complex culture. All right, that's it on culture and communication. We'll move on in our next lecture. Gotta turn this off.